Welcome to our second crypto webinar. Today, we are very glad to present to you our conversation about the evolving demand for innovative solutions and challenges for HSM and cloud encryption. Our host will be Paolo Basilio, Global Head of Practice for Consultancy and Audit Services for Foragenics. And with Paolo is Adam Kaysen. He's the President of Global and Strategic Alliances for Futurex. Both of them hold extensive experience in the information security field, encryption, and payment industry. Adam is a specialist on hardnet enterprise security cloud.
Thanks a lot for joining, and obviously for Futurex to offer to come on this webinar and actually discuss these topics. Hopefully, I'll have some challenging questions for you.
And play some stump the chump here.
Yeah, absolutely, and we'll try and pick your brain and get as much insight behind the curtain of the HSM vendor environment without you exposing too much that may be sensitive. But so just going into a recap of the previous session, the first episode of the series, we really centered in around three particular topics, and of course I'd like to just get your take on the sort of on those topics. We looked at what is the cost of cryptographic architecture, and of course, you know, as an HSM vendor, you sell a lot of these products, but of course it's not just the cost of the products, it's also, you know, key management operations and what that makes you do, send custodians, you know, here and there, and the use of paper and various other things that you require to make your operational environment work around these particular devices. And ultimately we drew the conclusion that it's incredibly costly at the moment. And that is, well, for better or worse, as a result of compliance requirements or whatever else, that's what the current situation is. So that was the one sort of point that we drove across in the first webinar. And of course, we looked at what a potential future could be. And that's obviously, you know, two security guys sitting in a room thinking, hey, this is how the future should be. Of course, you on the HSM vendor side probably have a little bit more context around, well, you know, this is possible, that is not possible. And of course, on the PTS side, a little bit of insight into what is required from a lab perspective and various requirements and restrictions that are put on you as a vendor in terms of the type of functionality. And of course, obviously that tied in then to what are the major hurdles. So, I mean, what is your general sense on, I think you attended the first webinar.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it was an excellent one. And I think really hearing a lot from you guys on the Foragenics team is interesting for us, just because you guys are really on the front line out there talking to a lot of the actual implementers of this technology. And you know, sometimes from a vendor perspective, we look at it and say, all right, here's the ideal environment. Here's what it should look like if everything's going according to plan. But, you know, really once you get out there in the field, you see there are so many different diverse environments, ecosystems, use cases out there. And it's definitely not a one size fits all type thing. You know, it actually kind of builds a little bit on the concept of the cost of cryptographic architecture. And it's like that can be so different depending on organization to organization. You know, for some, their core business really has no business dealing with IT infrastructure in general. And so they know that and understand that and make attempts, not just with security, but with really all manner of IT infrastructure, finding what they can push out to the cloud. Others maintain very large IT shops and they say, hey, you know what? Maybe on-prem is the best for us. Maybe a hybrid approach is the best for us. And there are so many different angles to look at it from out there.
Yeah, and not just that. I think in the last year, particularly with COVID, or the last year and a half, I mean, COVID's really stepped in and changed all of that. You know, there's, having on-prem and having key management operations that require a lot of movement, for example, have just totally been shut down, or have been delayed somewhat. In fact, we actually have a poll, and I'd like to get a sense from the audience. And basically, the question we'd like to ask is, has working remotely caused delays in your organization carrying out important HSM and key management activities? And I'd think that invariably the answer there would be mostly yes, I'd imagine. But I guess it depends on the region, and it depends on sort of the types of restrictions that have been put in place. So it looks like the polls are coming in a bit, and well, invariably, as we would have thought, of course, COVID has caused delays in carrying out these particular activities. Over 70% of the answers have been yes there. I think that just demonstrates exactly what COVID has done, and of course, as a result of that, the need for us to evolve our key management and HSM management activity, and the need for sort of a more distributed key management operation and cloud, or HSMs being managed in a sort of a cloud type environment, become all the more important.
One of the things that's been interesting that we've seen to that same effect over the last year in particular is, historically remote management in general, but in particular of cryptographic infrastructure, it was viewed as something where, there should be a very easy way to find out if it makes sense to implement, at least from a cost-centric perspective. How often do you need to visit the data center, whether it's for major key loading, whether it's for firmware updates, whether it's for maintenance, what's the cost of doing that? In some cases, flying multiple people across the country. And so typically the decision about whether to go with certain remote management capabilities was kind of a factor of that. But over the last year or so, people have changed thinking a lot. And now the possibility that enforced remote management through no control over their own might, is not an unrealistic scenario. It's really changed the decision-making process there in a lot of cases.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's remote management. It's also the, multiple people needing to be together in the same place, and potentially people from different regions meeting up. It kind of breaks all the COVID restriction rule book, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, I mean, I think the consensus is there, and that things need to evolve. But I think what people really want to hear on this presentation is more about Futurex and how Futurex are handling this type of or these type of solutions going forward. So I'd like to just move the focus over a little bit to Futurex, and I guess many of the people on this call probably know exactly who Futurex is, but just for the sake of clarity, could you provide us just with a bit of insight on who Futurex is and where you fit into the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I can give a real quick rundown and all that. So Futurex, to give a little bit of background, we are a manufacturer of enterprise class data security solutions. So we focus on really three main areas. One would be HSMs, or hardware security modules, both for payments and general purpose crypto processing. One of the unique things in that area for us is that being an organization that has 40 years of experience and one that's grown organically over time, the way we've deployed our technology and our underlying firmware is such that there's not really any fundamental difference between the general purpose side and the payment side. So really all of our HSMs are capable of both from that standpoint. So something we've tried to really make the market aware of is that the distinction between a payment HSM and a general purpose HSM doesn't necessarily have to be a difference in the foundational underlying technology. It's more about algorithms, use cases, implementations. We also do key and certificate management. So within that encompasses cloud key management, data protection, so which that would include file encryption or integration with third-party applications or database encryption. We do enterprise CA and PKI to include code signing as well, which is something that, over the last year in particular, that's also received a lot of attention out there in common media with a lot of things that have been going on. Beyond that, vaultless tokenization. And then finally, the third leg of the stool, as it were, would be cryptographic infrastructure management. So looking for very, very large organizations, ones that are deploying hundreds of HSMs, how do you deal with these very large scale distributed environments, making them scalable, making them automatable, making them ones where you don't have to do as much on your own in terms of disaster recovery, redundancy, high availability, and just how you view your crypto infrastructure more holistically. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about the concept of crypto as a service later. So I'll save a little bit of that for down the road. But as far as deployment models for us, we do on-premises hardware appliances. So we design and develop our own cryptographic modules completely in-house. Those are all certified under FIPS 140-2 Level 3 and PCI HSM standards. And then we also offer cloud services as well. So we've been doing hardware since 1981 and cloud services through our VirtuCrypt service since 2014.
Yeah, interesting. And the VirtuCrypt service is one I've heard a bit about, and we've obviously discussed it before, which was actually something I wasn't aware of till about 6 months to a year ago, actually. So that's quite interesting. Obviously, you've now sort of opened up the product space into the sort of cloud service type of services for cryptography. What is the main drivers from your perspective behind offering that product set? And of course, I mean, you've done your market analysis and whatever, and have understood that clients are sort of moving in this direction. So, what sort of are the main drivers behind clients wanting to move or migrate to cloud for, the use of cryptographic services and resources?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question. And, probably for the benefit of everybody on the webinar today, I'm not going to bore you with a lot of the traditional, reasons to move to the cloud. I mean, honestly, everybody has kind of heard those for, the better part of the past decade now. And so the cloud is very much in an established state overall for general IT and corporate workloads. And so that's fairly well known. And obviously those same features and benefits do apply to cloud HSMs and key management, on-demand provisioning, scalability, high availability, so on and so forth. But in particular, when it comes to HSMs, both for general purpose and payment, but I think a lot of our audience today being focused on payments, there are a couple of areas that are really interesting and are a little bit unique. So one would be the compliance side of things. So when you're dealing with a payment processing ecosystem, there are a lot of different compliance requirements that come into play. And so they're kind of two sides of it. One is meeting those compliance requirements, going through the process of getting reviewed and certified there. But the other really, I think, is truly understanding the core meaning of those requirements, why they exist, and how there are ways that organizational security posture really is enhanced by adhering to those. And it's not just a set it and forget it, checkbox compliance kind of thing. It's more about having a fundamental understanding. And so one of the things we've really seen with organizations interested in the cloud for their HSMs is the understanding and the mind share that comes with having people who are dealing with it, living and breathing it day in and day out. A organizations, particularly smaller ones, they have out of necessity a lot of people who wear many hats, and that's great, and that helps organizations be agile. But I mean, at the same time, do you want someone who is also responsible for dealing with their Active Directory environment and setting up privileged access management and switches and firewalls and fixing the receptionist printer? I mean, do you want them also managing your HSMs? Well, maybe not. So that's one.
It's interesting on that one, because you kind of see two models when you're out there doing assessments. Larger organizations will have dedicated teams that are managing cryptographic infrastructure and key management and so on. And I'm talking, large banks or very, very large organizations that have loads of cryptographic resources and a large architecture to manage. But then, of course, you get the smaller entities, which we've assessed organizations that have 5 or 6 people. So it's you're inevitably you might be the CEO, the HSM admin, and the key custodian. It's a bit extreme,
no
but
pressure. Yeah,
it's a bit of an extreme example. But yeah, I think that for organizations like that, you might want to sort of where you have the small size, you might want to just look to sort of outsource all of that to a third party, or use it as a service rather than have to manage it on site yourself. So yeah, anyway.
One other big one that we've seen a lot of interest in, especially on the enterprise side, where as you mentioned, they do have very well established teams. They've got a lot of people who are dealing with this day in and day out, and it is their core focus. One of the areas that they've really found interesting about the cloud in particular is the ability to move quickly. So a lot of times, let's say large tier 1 organization, they're looking at spinning up a new project, or maybe doing an exploratory phase to just do a POC.
Yeah.
So they've got a couple of options there. I mean, either they can try to break away some of their existing on-prem resources. They could, get some POC or eval gear and have it shipped in. And, obviously last year, getting into the data center to actually install that equipment was pretty tricky. And even lockdowns notwithstanding, for a lot of enterprise organizations, putting in a change request window for data center access requires a huge amount of approvals and sign-offs and red tape and things like that. But if they can look at the cloud and say, hey, you know what, I need to spin up a test HSM for a new payment application we're testing. And they can say, all right, well, great, let's go ahead and provision it. It's an OpEx based cost, so it's not like they have to requisition any capital funding or anything like that. Yeah. And they can essentially do a few button clicks and be online later that afternoon. It helps them really accelerate their project workflow to a big degree.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. I'd like to just lead the audience into another polling question here as well, which I think is relevant to the conversation. So the question is, how do you envision your new HSM deployments over the coming 5 years? Entirely on premises, entirely in the cloud, hybrid with most on premises, or hybrid with most in the cloud? I think it would be interesting to get the view from the audience on that one in particular.
So let's see. So Paolo and I were kind of discussing this beforehand. We've got our own hunches where things will turn out. We'll see if that ends up being true. Of course, I won't admit it if it's not. So.
Well, exactly. I think a lot of the drive is also because, well, most everything else is on the cloud, or at least in certain cases, especially with sort of small medium enterprises. It's most of your processing, your capabilities are all sort of started off in the cloud. Of course, with all the benefits, as you mentioned earlier, that you don't have to sort of reiterate on, but all those resources on the cloud to use sort of HSM services that are there as well. Just makes a lot of sense. Anyway, the polling questions are in, and hybrid with most on premises. So there certainly is kind of looking like there is a need for having sort of this HSM deployments in the cloud environment. But for the time being, I think most of that is probably going to be on premise for the next 5 years, but not far behind is most in the cloud as well. So I think I think these answers are more sort of speaking to the fact that, well, a lot of this is requirements at the moment. So in terms of I work with a particular vendor. I have particular HSMs that I use, and well, at the moment, I don't have that kind of service out there with this, I guess, particular HSM vendor or model that I'm using, and I've integrated all my systems into this. So, I need to deploy these things, and I don't have another option. I have to do these on premise. So I think there's probably going to be a lot of that, but at the same time, this clearly shows that there is a will or a want to move to a more cloud based environment for management of these services. So I think it's probably a good idea then to move into sort of the next slide, and well, I guess what I'm looking for here, and which we discussed earlier, is your VirtueCrypt solution. I'd like to understand, how does that work? Because we've looked at as security assessors, we've evaluated various different sort of a cloud and sort of pseudo cloud or crypto as a service solutions. And we've seen sort of various types of implementation models and so on. So I think it'll be a good exercise to have a look at sort of how the VirtueCrypt Futurex's model or Futurex's approach to this, how that looks. And hopefully I can ask some questions and take it apart a bit, if you don't mind.
Absolutely, go right for it.
Cool. So do you want to start by sort of giving us an overview of VirtueCrypt and how it works?
For sure. And so I think what this diagram right here shows are 3 different models for deploying cloud-based HSMs out there, in particularly focused on the payment ecosystem, I think, with a lot of our audience today. But this really lines up, I think, a lot with those poll results you just took. We've got a lot of people out there who are still wanting to maintain some level of on-premises HSMs, either in a hybrid environment, or I know a lot of people right now are in a scenario, or will be over the next probably 12 months, where legacy HSMs they have are approaching end of life. So they're evaluating options out there for cloud, for on-prem, for hybrid, for anything like that. But essentially, 3 options here. One being on-prem application with on-prem HSMs, and then using an external cloud like VirtueCrypt for either purposes of disaster recovery or scalability, or perhaps migrating other use cases to the cloud gradually and looking at a transition process. The next would be full cloud HSM, where you've got on-prem applications, but then cloud HSMs for it. And then the third would be the public cloud integration, such as with AWS or Azure or Google, or really any public cloud provider out there. And that's one of the unique ones out there, and it's actually where we're seeing a lot of interest right now, because a lot of organizations have either internal desires or even mandates to move certain percentages of their workloads out to the cloud and not be maintaining them internally. And so one of the hurdles historically has been, well, listen, if I can move maybe my payment application out to an AWS EC2 instance, but I'm still going to have to manage the payment HSMs on-prem, it doesn't really justify it necessarily. And this kind of changes the decision-making for them on that, where, for example, someone can go on AWS Marketplace, search for a cloud payment HSM, and essentially spin one up right there through their own AWS account, or Azure or others there. But one of the common questions we get on this as it relates to the public cloud that I think is relevant here is, okay, so are your HSMs inside an AWS data center, for example? And the answer is no, mainly because compliance and that piece there. And that's one of the things that's really important to look at with the cloud is, are you looking at a provider that has the compliance certifications you need, both now and in the future? So, for example, we go through PCI PIN, PCI DSS, of course, PCI P2PE. So everything both for issuing payment cards and mobile payments, as well as transaction acquiring, really everything like that. A lot of the requirements involved with that really can't be done outside of a dedicated environment with some very specific security controls around how that's deployed and managed. Yeah,
absolutely. And that was going to be sort of the question that I wanted to lead into, is that, have you gone through all the, security assessments from a P2P perspective, or PIN security, 3DS, whatever type of sort of assessment services that cover cryptographic hardware? And well, you've mentioned that those certifications have been achieved for that environment. How does it work under the hood, though? And of course, granted, you might not be able to share certain things with me, but I mean, are these dedicated HSMs behind the scenes that basically are performing these cryptographic services? Are they in different data centers in, around the world, or do clients have dedicated devices to themselves, or is it something where there's sort of a multi-tenancy model? Sorry, that's a lot of questions in one sentence.
That's good stuff. I'll stop me if I forget any, but I think just to start off on the compliance angle, it's a fun one. So we do have data centers worldwide, really virtually all global regions out there, both for purposes of latency as well as data residency in some cases. And that one's a really interesting topic for a lot of reasons. But I would say we're fairly well practiced at being almost under perpetual audit, whether it's for standards such as those put forth by PCI and others, or individual processor audits or things like that. So we've got a fairly busy team that spends just about every waking moment on that side of things. But looking at service architecture under the hood, one of the things that's important to think about with the cloud really is automation and how that works, because without the ability to spin up, spin down cloud HSMs, do things like create high availability clusters across multiple data centers, and do all those things you would traditionally look at a cloud service for, it's not really as much of a cloud service. It's more co-location, which is fine, and maybe the right fit in some scenarios. But most of the interest we're seeing out there in the market now are with people who do want that granular level of control, where they're able to have their own HSMs, they're able to do what they want with them, and able to really control them in a manner that fits the traditional expectations for a cloud service. So multi-tenancy, as far as that, so our HSMs have something we call Hsm Virtualization on it, where individual HSMs, individual physical devices, can be separated out, not partitioned. That's a little bit of a different scenario, but we can actually create multiple separate virtual HSMs, all within the confines of a single physical one. So what that means is each individual customer has their own dedicated virtual HSMs that has their own security policy, users, major keys, processing power, In particular, that's an important one because it is a multi-tenant environment. And one of the big questions we often see is, well, listen, this is a multi-tenant environment. What happens if another customer on the same hardware really maxes out their throughput? And the answer is, well, you've got dedicated throughput, so no one can take that from you.
Okay, I mean that's you covered big things in that one sentence. So, and particularly why I say it's big things, it's from a compliance perspective. I think, you know, and a security perspective, it's always important to say, well, in terms of major keys or master keys, etc. You know, are my keys shared, or are they, you know, something that I can control and that I have access to manage, create, etc. And in this zone where I'm consuming cryptographic services, you know, is that dedicated to me? Users, as you mentioned as well. I think
key
that's
storage
also
space is included there. Yeah, network stack, really the whole thing.
Okay, that's really interesting. Because I think this is key, especially in the first episode of the series. We discussed the fact that autonomy of keys and users, configurations, whatever, within a multi-tenanted environment becomes vital, I think, from a security perspective, and certainly that the design ought to have that in mind, at least from a security perspective, and hopefully the PCI Council or other standards bodies will recognize that with this service offering evolving around in the cryptography space, that requirements ought to be set up for shared hosting providers, like is the case with PCI DSS, but in a shared cryptographic service environment, which is probably slightly more sensitive.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, it's you know, it's worth noting that as part of both our PCI PIN audits as well as our PCI HSM review, our multi-tenancy was evaluated and approved and went through there. So that's something that, you know, before we wanted to go ahead and move into that model, you know, obviously it took a lot of thinking from an architectural perspective, from a compliance perspective, and so that's something that was very important to us from the ground up to make sure that this ticks all the boxes from a compliance perspective. Without that, payments industry is pretty tough to really go anywhere in.
Absolutely. I mean, I've noticed the listing on the council website for P2PE for VirtueCrypt. So yeah, I've seen those certifications there. So it's good that the assessor you use basically went through the multi-tenancy aspects of it, and client data and how that's sort of managed on that end. It's probably a conversation I'd like to probe further with you, maybe not on this session because we're definitely going to run out of time, but in the future, perhaps a follow-up session.
For sure. No, it's a fun one. And it's also worth noting that some organizations, typically larger ones, they do opt for a bare metal offering as well, where there are actually dedicated physical HSMs that are allocated only to them, that they can then spin up virtual HSMs on that, you know, up, down, scale up, scale down, et cetera. So two different models, but yeah, both are there.
Okay. So another topic I wanted to discuss, and sorry, I got to move us along because of the time. But the other topic was bring your own key versus key agent services. So in terms of, we discussed this previously, that in terms of the VirtueCrypt service or cloud HSM services, there's sort of two models. The one is BYOK, bring your own key, and the other model is key agent services. Give us a bit of an overview, I guess, on these two.
For sure. So, you know, this is one that's been really interesting, in particular over the last year and a half, with some of the drivers towards remote work and things like that. But in the payments industry in particular, major key management is critical. That's something where without the ability to compliantly load and manage those keys, again, that's another real deal breaker out there. So for us, we've taken the track of offering two different models. The first is what we call BYOK, or bring your own key, and that uses one of our Xcrypt Touch devices. So it's an actual FIPS 140-2 level 3 and PCI HSM validated tablet. Not a rebranded Android or anything like that. It's entirely our own design, and it contains one of our crypto modules inside of it. So for organizations that do want to manage their own keys, to hold those, to have them be the only ones with control or visibility at all over them, they can use that and remotely connect in to their cloud HSM, load those keys on their own, and then be off to the races. That model is typically, I would say, used more by the very large organizations that have established key management teams, that they have all their processes in place already. And so for them, it's more just an extension of what they're doing already. The other is the key agent services, where our solutions architects on our customers' behalf will go in and compliantly load those keys, those major keys in there. And so that's something that our PCI audits cover, the processes and policies involved with that. Right. And to be quite honest, I would say upwards of 85% of our customers use the key agent model because.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it fits in really with the whole cloud model. I mean, if you're looking at offloading responsibility for hosting, for maintenance, for everything like that, they say, well, let's not go halfway. Let's just let someone else deal with that. Make it not our problem, essentially. But there's also the peace of mind knowing that, hey, you've got people there 24/7 who live and breathe this, so you can be pretty certain the policies are well vetted.
Right. Yeah. I mean, practically speaking, then the bring your own key model is the client has an Xcrypt Touch, and they have two custodians, and the two custodians kind of log in to the device, I imagine, and then we'll take a key component from their whatever master key they want to generate, or potentially generate it directly on the device. Right. And this Xcrypt Touch HSM is connecting to their virtual HSM instance, I presume, in the cloud. And basically then they generate their keys or load their keys or whatever.
Exactly. Although worth noting, they don't actually have to be in the same place for that. So we have split component loading where, let's say you've got key custodians who are in different parts of the country or even the world. They can load their individual components separately and then form a quorum separately to combine those together. So particularly with distributed teams, that's been handy.
So they would each need an Xcrypt Touch, though, to do that?
Right.
Okay, yeah. All right. Well, in fact, that that was exactly what we were discussing in the first webinar. So that's quite interesting. Well, I'd like to announce a poll quickly, and then we can continue discussing this particular one. But would your company prefer to use the bring your own key model, or would you rather outsource key management completely? And the answers are outsource key management completely, bring your own key due to security concerns or privacy concerns, bring your own key, we have the operational team set up to do this anyway, so we just like to carry on with that. Or bring your own key, wait, isn't that a compliance requirement? So let's see the responses there. But I think, the feedback would be interesting because I've seen a lot of customers, especially sort of large banks that are like, well, I do not feel comfortable putting a key component in a Tampa bag and shipping it to, I don't know, somewhere across the world. I would rather handle my key management myself. And, they cite obviously security and privacy concerns and so on. for the reasoning behind that. So yeah, it's just interesting, or well, I've always been interested in the fact that, you know, there ought to be a model that allows you to actually exercise that right. Although you are using HSMs that are essentially made available to you by a service provider, who potentially would manage the master key. I don't know for that, but at least on some level would have some cryptographic key associated with the device.
Yeah. I mean, you know, really, I guess from my perspective on that, key management is an interesting one. I mean, you know, at the end of the day, though, it's the customer's major key. I mean, it's like it wouldn't be right to do any sort of vendor lock or anything like that. I mean, you know, it's one of the things that at least my belief is that fundamentally in the cloud, the idea that you've got workload portability, that you've got your ability, hey, you know what, if your service provider isn't doing the job you want them to do, well, great, pack up your stuff, including your keys, and go walk elsewhere. You know, and trying to throw artificial barriers in the way of doing that, I think would be a real impediment to the growth of the industry as a whole.
Absolutely. Just to bring in the results. So yeah, the majority, it's kind of spread all over the place, but the majority say bring your own key due to security concerns, and that was really what I was talking about in terms of, well, some of the larger organizations might say, well, I'd like to manage my own key management, generate my keys, handle my own keys, make sure that my security processes govern that end to end. So, well, it's, I think, a great option to have. Just one last question around the bring your own key. So in terms of the Xcrypt Touch HSMs, of course, between that device where you're entering your key component and the sort of destination host HSM, that channel's obviously encrypted. Is it using a PKI, or I mean, I suppose there might be a number of different cryptographic operations going in there, but essentially those channels, is it based on a certificate authority that is something public, or is it you know, Futurex managed? How does that all work?
For sure, there are a few different layers to that and a few different options for that. I'll put in a plug right now for anyone who's interested in learning a little bit more and diving a little bit deeper into this specific topic. We do have a white paper that goes into the connection security between this Xcrypt Touch device and HSMs, regardless of whether they're on-prem or the cloud. But you're spot on, Paolo, that one of the main things involved in it is a PKI that's unique per customer. And that establishes an encrypted, mutually authenticated connection. So that way, for example, you couldn't take your Xcrypt Touch and connect into someone else's HSM. It would automatically just reject it and say, sorry, you're not authorized to do this there.
Right.
So.
Well, I'd definitely like that white paper.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I'd like to look at. Well, I'd like to understand the technical details behind that.
For sure.
All right, great. Well, I think you know, it's interesting. A lot of the topics in terms of what we spoke about in terms of an ideal future, based on communicating with you in this session, seems to kind of be in place, or at least where you're moving toward. I think it's yeah, perhaps the industry at large that probably needs to start moving closer into that space. Yeah, I mean, I'll be careful not to tread around things like cost and that sort of thing, but I presume that ultimately in the future, sort of the service side and the scalability side is something that is probably from a pricing perspective also designed to be less than doing that sort of upfront capex cost,
Right.
and rather, costing things more out as a service or costing things as you scale up and actually need the resources that you are basically consuming
Exactly.
with your
Yeah,
systems.
for sure. I mean, I'm happy to speak at a high level to pricing just real quick. I mean, we've tried to kind of democratize that a little bit. And honestly, anybody wants to get some details as far as pricing goes, just go to AWS Marketplace and search for either Futurex or Cloud Payment HSM, and you spot it right there. So, but you're right, it's really a bigger question than just, all right, what's the OpEx cost of the Cloud Payment HSM? It's more, all right, what do you need in terms of SLA? You know, will 99.9% work? Do you want 5 nines? Do you want beyond that? What are you dealing with on-prem as far as your architecture? All sorts of different variables factor in.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Right, I think from here we'll move on to really our final slide, and this is just to get the sort of Futurex view on, you know, what does the future hold for cryptographic services, HSM hosting, key management, that sort of thing. And you know, we did have a brief conversation about this before, but yeah, it's probably something we can flesh out a bit more in conversation. So yeah, talk to me about unifying cryptographic resources.
For sure, absolutely, and I will try to zip through a few of these. I apologize, I'm kind of long-winded otherwise, so I'll zip through these so we can get to some of the questions that are starting to come in a minute here. But you know, one of the biggest trends we're seeing now, especially in the enterprise, is the unification of crypto. Essentially, the establishment of core cryptographic infrastructure, where you know, rather than having dozens of different independent business units, groups, individual HSM stacks that deal with different things, organizations are looking at using functionality like HSM virtualization and multi-tenancy, even within their own environment, not even considering the cloud, but within their own environment, to parcel out those resources and say, all right, maybe we've got a single HSM and key management stack here, but we're going to break off some resources to our Active Directory certificate services environment, and some others to our Venafi environment, others to CyberArk, others to our payment ecosystem, others to our Oracle database environment, you know, all of that, but housing it under a single team, really streamlining the management and not having to deal with a lot of the headaches that come from a more fragmented application constrained architecture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's, it seems logical. If you look at, you know, sort of the different services that that entities have cryptographic architecture set up for, you know, there's issuing, you know, there's acquiring, processing pins, this, that, and typically it's all sort of different sets of kit, you know, hardware over here, hardware over there, usually different types of models, different types of vendors. You know, a lot of the larger customers I deal with have, you know, 4, 5, 6 different HSM vendors, you know, that do things slightly differently. And of course, you know, all the different services that they have are using these different cryptographic resources provided by the architecture there, which, as we discussed in the first webinar session, it's very costly to maintain. So it makes sense that unifying these resources and having sort of a crypto engine room providing services to the rest of the business makes a lot of sense. Also threw in multi-tenancy there, of course. You know, as you mentioned, that kind of capability is already there, but certainly ties in, I guess, to the cryptographic, the unification of cryptographic resources as well. Right, we are running very tight on time, so I'm going to move into the questions because we just have 6 minutes.
But for sure, we've got some fun ones coming in already, I see.
Yeah, as I said, we'll answer all the questions in a blog post, and that will be published and circulated to everyone. But let's try and tackle these in here so long. So I'm going to jump on the first one. A question to Forgenix: how often is it seen that payment service providers outsources their key management to banks, meaning the payment service provider has a specific bank to take custodianship of their master key? Is it not best for PSPs to generate, transport, and store their own master keys? Well, absolutely. I personally haven't seen any particular entity that would outsource their key management to a bank specifically. Payment service providers, if they maintain their own cryptographic infrastructure, generally we see that they would maintain their own key management and potentially share a key with a bank or an acquirer or issuer or whoever they provide services to. But absolutely, the PSP maintaining their own cryptographic architecture should be maintaining their own keys. And this is something that shouldn't be outsourced to a third party. Certainly, it would create a bit of a compliance issue there as well, because you'd have to then go and assess the bank's key management processes and procedures as well. So it creates a dependence there on the bank or acquiring entity or whoever in this case. Okay. Do you want to take one there, Adam?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an interesting one here. So the next question we've got is, how do you overcome the challenges in the countries in which you cannot transfer personal data outside of the country? It's actually a really common question, and one that there are a few different answers to it. It tends to be a little bit nuanced. But the first thing that I usually jump to when someone asks me that question is, well, are you certain necessarily? Because a lot of times when we dig into it with the organization themselves and start actually looking into some of those legislative requirements, there are some distinctions made between data that's encrypted, data that's unencrypted, and what actually constitutes personal data. And so that's an important thing to know is, all right, what from a legal perspective, and granted, I'm not a lawyer or anything, but what actually is that data? Now, there are some environments where that is absolutely true. And honestly, the answer to that is, well, let's look as far as expansion goes. There are certain markets where it does make sense to have localized environments, either those delivered directly from the provider themselves or perhaps through a partner where that data residency can be achieved there. And that way you're still able to take advantage of some of the cloud services, but you don't have to deal with some of the data residency issues.
Awesome. Yeah, the next one, how would this work in terms of QSA wanting to view key management operations during a PCI assessment? Would the QSA need to visit each custodian at their home, etc., to see this working in practice using the Xscript touch, or would the audit logs suffice? Neil, that's an excellent question, and something that certainly isn't well defined from a standards perspective at this point. How the standards would require this working at this particular point in time is firstly that Xscript touch be stored under dual control. In other words, not be accessed under single control. And this presents the first challenge because it is a cryptographic device. It is an HSM. So the dual control aspect is important. Of course, it's being used in a way here that is a bit different to how the traditional sort of cryptographic devices are used, because essentially being able to use a single device to load a key is kind of the traditional way in which it's been used. So two custodians would come together, they would unlock the safe under dual control, they take out the HSM or Xscript touch in this case, and then they would log in under dual control as well, and then sort of perform their key management activity. So the concept, the standard hasn't moved to the point where it's addressing the concept of having two custodians in different regions doing their own component entry, and the dual control being a form of the fact that it's two separate devices maintained by two separate individuals in different locations. So the dual control is there sort of by design. And I think that's where things need to become a bit more agile from a security standards perspective. So P2P and PCI PIN, etc. That can then cater for this type of operating model. But yeah, at the moment, from an assessor perspective, I wouldn't want to see the Xcrypt touch at a person's home. So that's what the answer would be there. But hopefully, as things evolve, yeah, exactly. Hopefully, as things evolve, from a standards perspective, will cater the council will cater for these different models, and will have a better answer to that question. Do you want to take the one on key agent services?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is another good one. So the question is, with key agent services, how do we make sure that the components are not tampered with while they're being transmitted and then stored in the HSM? And so that one, and Paolo, feel free to jump in with some additional color on the compliance side that
Sure.
You're going to be a lot deeper than I am. But essentially the coverage for that aspect of it is handled by some pretty rigorous policies, procedures, all of which go through a variety of different audits under PCI and others there. So typically, like for transmitting, for example, really the same process that you would follow through any sort of key exchange key or network key sharing, regardless of whether it's with a processor or a payment network or anything else like that. The same types of policies apply here, where you'd have, for example, tamper evident bags. You would ship each component within their own T bag on a different day using a different carrier, all sorts of different granular aspects to it, but they're fairly complex there.
Yeah, absolutely. And just from a compliance perspective, of course, you'd expect the entity that you're sharing keys with to be meeting the PIN security requirements or the P2P requirements. And of course, if you're looking at a P2P solution or component, there needs to be SLA agreements in place and contracts in place that basically indicate that organizations should be meeting the requirements of the standard. And if they don't, of course, if there's compromises or things that are identified, you should be notified immediately. And of course, in terms of liability, if a compromise takes place on your end versus my end, and the standard itself addresses the need for contracts or agreements that manage that particular interaction. So yeah, that's between the two entities. And of course, in entities sending keys to one another in component form or so on, if there's a compromise en route at customs or something, of course, the process is to then destroy the keys and start the process over. And if that key is already protecting other keys, then it might mean destroying all the keys that are impacted in the chain. So there's a number of ways that we can that can be addressed if there is a particular compromise.
Yeah, and quite fortunately, a lot of that builds on many years of established process for key sharing between all sorts of different organizations.
Absolutely. With that, sorry, we've basically run out of time, so apologies if you've asked a question and we haven't gotten around to it. As I mentioned in the beginning, we will answer those questions in a blog and they'll be circulated to all the attendees. So thank you very much, Adam, for joining us on this today. I think what you've discussed here and what you've shown us has been incredibly insightful, and it certainly fills me with a bit of hope in terms of where things are going in the future from a cryptography perspective. From the attendees that have joined, please join us for our next session, our next series in the webinar, it should be in a few months' time. We will look to discuss these topics with other HSM vendors, and of course, also looking to get the council involved at a certain point as well, so that we can basically close the loop between the security experts, the HSM vendors, and of course the standard setting bodies, to make sure that we move cryptography and services around cryptography and compliance therein in the right direction.
Excellent. Well, Paolo, thank you very much, and to the entire Forgenix team for putting this together and hosting. You know, it's always a pleasure to get together and talk a little bit about the state of the industry and some of the exciting things we're seeing moving forward.
Awesome. Thanks. It's always a pleasure chatting to you, Adam.
Hey, you too.
Thank you all for attending.
Thank you. We'll talk to y'all soon.